I never imagined that a simple holiday dinner would unravel decades of carefully maintained secrets and completely transform my relationship with my family forever. My name is Emma, and I'm 42 years old now, though this story really begins when I was just a child growing up in a modest suburban home outside of Cleveland, Ohio. You see, there are families where love is distributed equally among children, where each accomplishment is celebrated with the same enthusiasm, where every child feels seen and valued. Mine was not one of those families, and it took me years to understand that the way I was treated wasn't normal, wasn't okay, and certainly wasn't my fault. When I look back at my earliest memories, before everything changed, I can almost convince myself that we were a typical American family. My parents, Linda and Robert, weren't particularly affectionate people, but they were present in their own way. My mother would help me practice my spelling words at the kitchen table while dinner simmered on the stove, and my father would occasionally take me to the local park to feed the ducks on Saturday mornings. We weren't the kind of family you'd see in holiday commercials, all warm hugs and shared laughter, but we functioned well enough. Had my own little pink bedroom with butterfly wallpaper, a collection of well-loved stuffed animals, and parents who, while not overly demonstrative, at least acknowledged my existence. Everything shifted dramatically when I was 9 years old. It was a cold February night when I was awakened by urgent voices and the sound of my Aunt Patricia rushing through our front door. I remember peering down the stairs, clutching my favorite teddy bear, watching as my parents threw on coats and gathered things in a frantic rush. Aunt Patricia found me there and ushered me back to bed, explaining in hushed tones that Mommy needed to go to the hospital because my baby sister was coming early. Very early. I didn't understand then what that meant. The gravity of a baby arriving nearly 3 months before she was supposed to. All I knew was that something big was happening, and the worried looks on everyone's faces made my stomach feel tight and uncomfortable. The next several weeks became a blur of disrupted routines and whispered conversations. My sister Lily had arrived weighing barely 3 pounds, a tiny fighter hooked up to more machines than I could count. The NICU became my parents' second home, and I became intimately familiar with various relatives' guest bedrooms. I'd spend a few nights with Aunt Patricia, then a week with Grandma Rose, then back to Aunt Patricia when Grandma had her book club meetings. Everyone assured me this was temporary, that soon Lily would be strong enough to come home and we'd all be together again. When Lily finally did come home after 2 months in the hospital, our house transformed into something unrecognizable. The familiar scent of my mother's lavender candles was replaced by the sharp smell of industrial disinfectant. Hand sanitizer dispensers appeared on every surface like mushrooms after rain. My mother, who had always been somewhat particular about cleanliness, became absolutely obsessed with germs. She'd follow me around with antibacterial wipes, cleaning doorknobs after I touched them, sanitizing surfaces I'd been near. The message was clear even to my young mind. I was dirty, dangerous, a walking threat to my fragile sister. The new rules were extensive and non-negotiable. No friends could come over. I had to change clothes immediately after school. My hands had to be washed for exactly 60 seconds, multiple times per day. And most devastating of all, if I showed even the slightest sign of illness, a single cough, a runny nose, even complaining of feeling tired, I was immediately packed off to stay with relatives. Not for a day or two, but for a week minimum, sometimes longer. My mother would pack my suitcase with this frantic energy, as if every second I remained in the house increased the danger to Lily exponentially. At first, I tried to see these exiles as adventures. Grandma Rose made the best chocolate chip cookies and would let me stay up past my bedtime watching old movies. Aunt Patricia had a massive collection of books and would read to me for hours. But as weeks turned to months and months turned to years, the reality of my situation became impossible to ignore. I wasn't going on fun sleepovers. I was being removed, extracted from my own home like a tumor that needed to be cut away to save the patient. The worst part was how my absences were never questioned or mourned. When I'd return after a week at Grandma's house, there was no joyful reunion, no "we missed you so much." Instead, my mother would inspect me like a border agent, checking for any signs of lingering illness before reluctantly allowing me back into the house. My father would barely look up from whatever he was doing, maybe offering a distracted, "Oh, you're back," if I was lucky. Meanwhile, Lily thrived under their constant attention. By the time she was 2, the doctors declared her completely healthy, no longer at any special risk. You'd think this would mean a return to normalcy, that I'd no longer be shipped away at the first sign of a sniffle. But by then, the pattern was too deeply established. Lily had learned that she was the center of the universe, and my parents had learned that their universe revolved around her. As Lily grew older, she developed an almost supernatural ability to manipulate our parents. She'd clutch her head and whisper about headaches whenever she didn't want to go to school. She'd claim exhaustion when it was her turn to do chores. She'd develop mysterious stomach aches right before any test she hadn't studied for, and every single time our parents would coddle her, excuse her, rearrange everyone's schedules to accommodate her needs. When I'd point out that she seemed miraculously better the moment she got what she wanted, I was scolded for being jealous and unsympathetic to my sister's delicate constitution. School became my refuge, the one place where my efforts were noticed and rewarded. Threw myself into my studies with the determination of someone who'd learned early that external validation was the only validation I'd receive. Every A on a test, every gold star on an assignment, every excellent work written in red pen at the top of an essay, these became my sustenance, feeding a part of me that was perpetually starving at home. I remember the exact moment I realized that no achievement would ever be enough to capture my parents' attention. I was in seventh grade and had just won first place in the state science fair with a project on sustainable water filtration systems that I'd spent months perfecting. I'd stayed after school every day, working with my teacher to refine my hypothesis and methodology. When they announced my name as the winner, I felt this surge of hope. Surely this would be big enough. Surely this would make them see me. I practically ran home clutching my trophy and certificate, bursting with the need to share this moment with my family. I found them in the living room, Mom, Dad, and Lily, who was sprawled dramatically across the couch claiming she felt dizzy. I stood in the doorway, trophy raised, huge smile on my face, and announced my victory. My mother glanced up briefly, said, "That's nice, dear," and immediately returned her attention to taking Lily's temperature for the fourth time that hour. My father asked if I could please keep my voice down as Lily had a headache. The trophy went on my bookshelf, where it collected dust along with all my other achievements that had failed to penetrate the lily bubble surrounding my parents. That's when something shifted inside me. I stopped trying to earn their attention and started planning my escape. Every babysitting job, every shift at the local grocery store, every dollar earned from tutoring younger students, it all went into my secret savings account. While my classmates were spending their money on clothes and concerts, I was building my freedom fund one minimum wage hour at a time. High school became an exercise in strategic planning. I joined every club that offered potential scholarships, maintained a perfect GPA not for their approval anymore, but for my own future, and researched colleges as far from Ohio as possible. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Chen, became more of a parental figure than my actual parents. She was the one who helped me navigate financial aid applications, celebrated with me when I got into Columbia, and hugged me when I broke down in her office after my parents forgot my 18th birthday because Lily had a very important orthodontist appointment that day. Speaking of forgotten birthdays, that had become something of a tradition in our household. My 16th birthday coincided with Lily's spring dance recital, where she performed a mediocre routine to memory from Cats. The entire extended family attended, cheering wildly for her off-key performance. I spent that birthday working a double shift at the diner, where my manager, recognizing the date from my employment forms, surprised me with a small cake that the kitchen staff had made. I sat in the break room, eating grocery store sheet cake with people who were essentially strangers, and they showed me more kindness in that moment than my family had in years. The birthday situation perfectly encapsulated our family dynamic. Lee's birthdays were events. Professionally catered parties, designer cakes, mountains of presents, relatives driving in from 3 states away. My birthdays were afterthoughts at best, completely forgotten at worst. One year, my mother actually asked me why I seemed moody on my birthday, having completely forgotten what day it was. When I reminded her, she had the audacity to be offended that I hadn't reminded her sooner, as if it was my responsibility to ensure my own birthday was remembered. But the universe has a funny way of balancing scales. While I was being ignored at home, I was discovering a passion that would eventually change everything. It started innocently enough, helping my Grandma Rose organize her jewelry collection during one of my many exile visits. She had these beautiful vintage pieces, costume jewelry mostly, but each one had a story. She'd tell me about the brooch her mother wore to her wedding, the pearl necklace she'd saved for months to buy for her college graduation, the Art Deco earrings she'd found at an estate sale that turned out to be worth far more than she'd paid. I became fascinated not just with the jewelry itself, but with the stories, the history, the way a trained eye could spot the difference between worthless costume pieces and hidden treasures. Grandma Rose, thrilled to have someone share her interest, taught me everything she knew. We'd spend hours going through her collection, researching maker's marks, learning about different eras and styles. She even started taking me to estate sales and antique shops, teaching me how to negotiate, how to spot quality, how to trust my instincts. What started as a way to pass time during my exiles became a genuine expertise. By high school, I had a reputation among local antique dealers as the teenager with the eye for hidden gems. I'd buy pieces for a few dollars at garage sales and flip them for 10 times that amount after properly identifying and authenticating them. My little freedom fund grew faster than I'd ever imagined possible. My parents, naturally, had no idea any of this was happening. When they bothered to ask what I did at Grandma's house, I'd simply say, helped with some organizing, and they'd nod absently, already turning their attention back to whatever Lily crisis was unfolding that day. They never asked about the vintage pieces I'd started wearing, never noticed when I upgraded my laptop with my own money, never wondered how I could afford application fees for multiple Ivy League schools. College acceptance day was surreal. I'd applied to 12 schools, all of them out of state, all of them excellent. When the acceptances started rolling in, Columbia, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, I felt validated in a way I'd never experienced before. These institutions saw value in me, saw potential, saw someone worth investing in. I chose Columbia partly for its excellent business program, but mostly because it put an entire country between me and my family. The day I told my parents I'd been accepted to Columbia on a nearly full scholarship remains etched in my memory with painful clarity. It was dinner time, one of the rare occasions when we all sat at the table together. Lily was complaining about her chemistry teacher, who had the audacity to expect her to actually study for tests. My parents were offering suggestions for how she could get extra credit or perhaps transfer to an easier class. I cleared my throat and announced that I'd been accepted to Columbia University with a presidential scholarship covering 90% of tuition. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then my mother said, "That's nice, dear. Lily, have you talked to your counselor about switching to regular chemistry instead of honors?" And just like that, one of the biggest moments of my life was dismissed, filed away as less important than Lily's desire to avoid challenging herself academically. I excused myself from the table, went to my room, and called Mrs. Chen, who screamed with joy and told me how proud she was. That night, I decided that I would never again expect emotional support from my biological family. Moving to New York felt like stepping into a different universe. For the first time in my life, I was just Emma. Not Lily's sister, not the family afterthought, just me. I threw myself into my studies and internships with the same determination I'd always had, but now it was fueled by excitement rather than desperation. I double majored in business and art history, spent my weekends prowling flea markets and estate sales in all 5 boroughs, and built a network of connections in the antique and jewelry world. My junior year, I started a small authentication service from my dorm room. What began as a side hustle to help fellow students verify the authenticity of designer goods they'd bought secondhand quickly evolved into something bigger. Word spread that I had an exceptional eye and encyclopedic knowledge of jewelry history. Soon I was consulting for vintage shops, helping estate lawyers value collections, even doing authentication work for insurance companies. By the time I graduated, I had a business plan, a solid client base, and enough saved to rent a small office space in the jewelry district. My parents attended my graduation, but only because Lily had a college tour scheduled in Boston the same week and New York was on the way. They sat through the ceremony looking bored, left immediately after without attending any of the celebration events, and managed to make even this accomplishment about Lily by spending the entire lunch discussing which colleges would best accommodate her unique learning style. The early years of building my business were challenging but exhilarating. I lived on ramen and determination, reinvesting every penny back into the company. I hired my first employee after 6 months, opened a second location after 2 years, and by year 5, I was authenticating pieces for major auction houses and ultra-high net worth clients. The business grew exponentially, but I kept my lifestyle modest, still scarred by years of feeling like I didn't deserve space or resources. Throughout this period, I maintained minimal contact with my family. I'd call on holidays, send cards for birthdays they'd forgotten I knew about, and even started sending my parents a monthly check once the business became profitable. The money was my way of preemptively shutting down any future claims that I'd abandoned them. But also, despite everything, some part of me still hoped it might make them see me as valuable, as worthy of their attention and pride. The calls home followed a predictable pattern. My mother would spend 2 minutes asking performative questions about my life before launching into an exhaustive update on Lily's latest drama. Lily, who had dropped out of 3 different colleges, cycled through numerous career attempts funded by our parents, and seemed to have a gift for turning every opportunity into a crisis. There was the semester she studied fashion design before deciding the industry was too competitive. The 6 months she tried to be a yoga instructor before discovering that required actual physical effort. The brief stint as a social media influencer that ended when she realized consistent content creation was exhausting. Each failed venture came with a hefty price tag that my parents covered without question, draining their retirement savings and taking on debt to fund Lily's journey of self-discovery. Meanwhile, my monthly checks helped cover their groceries and utilities, a fact that was never acknowledged or appreciated. It was simply expected, as natural as breathing, that I would contribute while Lily consumed. The business continued to thrive beyond my wildest dreams. We expanded to 5 cities, employed over 50 people, and became the go-to authentication service for several prestigious auction houses. I was invited to speak at conferences, featured in trade publications, and built a reputation as one of the foremost experts in vintage jewelry authentication. My personal collection grew to include pieces that would make museum curators weep with envy, each one acquired through careful negotiation and my ability to spot treasures others overlooked. Despite my success, I kept it largely private. My social media presence was minimal, my lifestyle understated. I lived in a beautiful but not ostentatious apartment, drove a reliable but not flashy car, and found joy in the work itself rather than the trappings of wealth. Years of being invisible had made me comfortable in the shadows, and I saw no reason to step into a spotlight that had never wanted to find me anyway. This brings us to that fateful Thanksgiving. I'd been considering skipping it altogether, maybe booking a trip somewhere warm where gratitude wasn't served with a side of emotional manipulation. But Lily had called, playing the family card with unexpected skill, talking about how important it was that we all be together, how she had big news to share. Against my better judgment, partly out of curiosity and partly out of that persistent hope that maybe this time would be different, I agreed to attend. The family home looked exactly as it always had, frozen in time like a museum exhibit of my childhood disappointments. The same faded wallpaper, the same squeaky third step on the staircase, the same formal dining room used only for holidays and Lily's various celebration dinners. It offered to cater the meal, knowing my parents' financial situation, but my mother insisted on handling everything herself. Pride preventing her from accepting help even as she served a turkey that was clearly the cheapest option at the grocery store. As family members arrived, I fell into my familiar role of helpful but invisible daughter. I set the table while Lily held court in the living room, regaling everyone with stories of her latest venture, something involving essential oils and wellness coaching that sounded suspiciously like a pyramid scheme. I helped in the kitchen while relatives fawned over Lily's new haircut, her outfit, her energy. It was like stepping back in time, except now I had the emotional distance to find it almost amusing rather than painful. Dinner began with the traditional going around the table, sharing what we were thankful for. Lily gave a lengthy speech about being grateful for her supportive family, her journey of self-discovery, and the universe's abundant blessings. My parents beamed at her like she'd just cured cancer. When it was my turn, I simply said I was grateful for good health and new opportunities, keeping it brief and vague as always. The conversation naturally turned to careers and accomplishments, as it tends to do when extended family gathers. Cousin Marcus had made partner at his law firm. Aunt Patricia's daughter had just had her third baby. Uncle James was retiring after 30 years with the same company. Then someone, I think it was Aunt Patricia, turned to me and asked about my little antique business. That's when Lily, perhaps emboldened by wine or jealous of attention directed elsewhere, decided to drop her bombshell. "Oh, Emma doesn't deal with antiques anymore," she said with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "She's got some fancy authentication thing going on. She's probably too important for us regular folks now." The condescension in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. I should have let it go, changed the subject, maintained the status quo. But something about the way she said it, the way she managed to make my success sound both insignificant and pretentious at the same time, finally broke through my carefully maintained composure. "It's not that fancy," I replied calmly. "We just help people verify the authenticity and value of jewelry and precious objects. The business has grown quite a bit since I started it." "Grown how much?" Uncle James asked, genuinely curious. I could have deflected, could have kept things vague. But I was tired. Tired of minimizing myself, tired of playing small, tired of pretending that my accomplishments didn't matter. So I told the truth. We have offices in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, and London. About 60 employees now. We handled over 3,000 authentication requests last year, with a total value of items processed exceeding $200 million. The silence was deafening. Forks suspended halfway to mouths, wine glasses frozen in midair, everyone staring at me like I'd suddenly grown a second head. It was Lily who broke the silence, her voice sharp with disbelief in something else. Jealousy, maybe, or anger at being upstaged. 200 million? That's impossible. You're making that up. I pulled out my phone, bringing up a recent Forbes article about our company. Here's an article about us from last month. We were featured as one of the top specialty service businesses in the luxury sector. My mother snatched the phone from my hands, her eyes scanning the article with growing disbelief. I watched her face change as she read, saw the moment when she reached the part about my estimated net worth. Her hand started shaking. $15 million? She whispered. It says here your company is valued at $15 million. The company is valued at that, I corrected gently. My personal net worth is less than that. I didn't mention that less still meant about 12 million after my recent calculations. What happened next was like watching a dam burst. My mother's shock transformed into rage so quickly it was almost frightening. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor, and started screaming. Not just yelling, screaming about how I'd hidden this from them, how I'd let them struggle, how I'd watched Lily take out student loans while I sat on millions like some kind of miser. My father joined in, his usually passive demeanor replaced by red-faced fury. "We raised you," he shouted. "We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us? By hiding your success and letting your family suffer?" Suffer? I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. I've been sending you $7,000 a month for the past 5 years. That's more than most people make working full-time. If you're suffering, it's not because of lack of support from me. But they weren't listening. Lee was crying, of course she was, wailing about how betrayed she felt, how she deserved to know, how as my sister she was entitled to share in my success. Extended family members were choosing sides, voices rising, accusations flying. The carefully prepared Thanksgiving dinner sat forgotten as my family tore itself apart over money that had taken me years of blood, sweat, and tears to earn. I tried to explain, tried to make them understand. Told them about the 18-hour days when I was starting out. The meals skipped to save money for inventory, the nights spent sleeping on my office floor because I couldn't afford both rent and business expenses. I reminded them of every missed birthday, every overlooked achievement, every time I'd been sent away for the crime of existing too close to their precious Lily. But my words bounced off their anger like rain off a windshield. All they could see was the money. All they could think about was what they felt they were owed. My mother actually started making plans out loud. How much they'd need for a new house, what kind of car Lily deserved, how much should be set aside for Lily's next business venture. That's when I realized with crushing finality that I would never be more to them than a resource to be exploited. Not a daughter to be proud of, not a sister to celebrate with, just a bank account they felt entitled to access. The $7,000 a month I'd been sending wasn't appreciated as the generous gift it was. It was seen as an insult compared to what they now knew I had. I stood up, gathering my things with hands that were surprisingly steady. "I'm done," I said quietly, my voice cutting through their shouting. "I'm done trying to earn your love, done paying for your attention, done subsidizing Lily's failures while my successes go unnoticed. I'm done with all of it." My mother laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You can't just walk away from family," she sneered. "You owe us. We're your parents. Lily is your sister. Family takes care of family." "Family," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "When have you ever treated me like family? When have you ever taken care of me? I've been taking care of myself since I was 9 years old, and you decided I was too dangerous to be near your real daughter." I looked around the table at their faces. Some shocked, some angry, some calculating how much they might be able to get from me. Only Grandma Rose, sitting quietly at the end of the table, looked at me with something approaching understanding. "I'm canceling the monthly transfers," I announced, pulling out my phone and doing it right there in front of them. "If you want to see a cent from me in the future, you'll need to go through my lawyers. And trust me, they'll be very interested to hear about the years of emotional neglect and financial exploitation." The explosion of noise that followed was spectacular. Threats, pleas, guilt trips, and manipulations flew at me from every direction. But I was already walking away, my designer heels, which my mother had complimented as nice knockoffs earlier, clicking on the hardwood floor as I made my way to the door. The last thing I heard before I left was Lily shrieking about how she deserved at least $2 million to start her wellness empire, and my mother already on the phone with someone, a lawyer, maybe, or a financial advisor, trying to figure out how to get access to money that was never theirs to begin with. The aftermath was both predictable and exhausting. My phone became unusable from the barrage of calls and texts. I had to change my number twice before they stopped finding ways to contact me. They tried everything: guilt, anger, threats, even brief attempts at love bombing where they'd send messages about how proud they were of me and how they'd always known I was special. Lily took to social media with a vengeance, painting herself as the victim of a cold-hearted sister who'd abandoned family in favor of money. She posted old photos of us as children with captions about how money had changed me, how success had made me forget where I came from. The irony of her using photos where I looked obviously miserable while she beamed at the camera seemed lost on her. They showed up at my offices in 3 different cities before I had security protocols put in place. They tried to contact my employees, my clients, even my doorman. My mother sent a certified letter demanding 50% of my net worth as repayment for raising you. My father left voicemails about how he'd never be able to retire because of my selfishness, conveniently forgetting that their financial troubles were largely due to funding Lily's endless failures. The extended family chose sides, as families do when money is involved. Some supported me, understanding that success earned shouldn't be automatically surrendered to those who demand it. Others painted me as selfish and cruel, buying into the narrative that family wealth should be communal wealth. I lost relationships with cousins I'd been close to, aunts and uncles who'd been kind to me during my exile years. But I also gained something invaluable: freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't operating under the delusion that if I just achieved enough, gave enough, succeeded enough, I'd finally earn my family's love and respect. I understood now that their love had always been conditional, and the conditions were impossible to meet because they changed with their needs. I threw myself into therapy, working with an excellent psychologist who specialized in family trauma and financial abuse. Through our sessions, I began to understand the patterns that had shaped me, the way I'd internalized my role as the giver, the way I'd equated my worth with my usefulness to others, the way I'd accepted scraps of attention as if they were feasts. The business continued to thrive, perhaps even more so now that I was putting all my energy into it rather than managing family drama. We expanded into Asia, opened a specialized division for ancient artifacts, and launched an educational program to train the next generation of authenticators. I found joy in mentoring young people who reminded me of myself, hungry for knowledge, eager to prove themselves, working twice as hard for half the recognition. 6 months after that Thanksgiving, I received a call from Grandma Rose. She was the only family member I'd stayed in contact with, the one person who'd shown me genuine love without conditions. She told me she was proud of me, not for the money or the success, but for finally standing up for myself. She also shared some interesting news. Without my monthly support and faced with the reality of their financial situation, my parents had been forced to downsize, and Lily had actually gotten a steady job for the first time in her life. Sometimes, Grandma Rose said in her wise way, the kindest thing you can do for people is stop enabling them. You weren't helping them by sending that money, sweetheart. You were just making it easier for them to avoid reality. She was right, of course. My financial support had allowed them to maintain their delusions, that Lily was just temporarily between successes, that their financial problems were bad luck rather than bad choices, that they didn't need to change because Emma would always be there to catch them. By walking away, I'd forced them to face reality for the first time. I've kept tabs on them from a distance, the way you might follow news about a natural disaster in a place you used to live. Lily's social media posts have shifted from aspirational lifestyle content to complaints about her retail job. My parents sold the family home and moved to a modest apartment. The extended family that had rallied around them, expecting to benefit from legal action against me, gradually drifted away when it became clear there would be no windfall. Sometimes I feel guilty. In quiet moments, usually late at night when the city is sleeping and I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder if I should have handled things differently. Should I have revealed my success gradually? Should I have set boundaries earlier? Should I have tried harder to build bridges instead of burning them? But then I remember the 9-year-old girl sent away for sneezing. The teenager whose achievements were invisible, the young woman who built an empire while being told she was worth less than her sister's failures. I remember that I tried for 30 years to earn their love through achievement and generosity, only to discover that their love was not available at any price. At least, not for me. The truth is, some families are broken in ways that can't be fixed by success or money or even forgiveness. Some dynamics are so entrenched, so toxic, that the only healthy choice is to walk away. It took me 40 years to understand that their inability to love me wasn't my failure, it was theirs. Now, my life is fuller than I ever imagined it could be. I have friends who celebrate my successes and support me through challenges. I have employees who respect me and clients who value my expertise. I have a beautiful home filled with art and jewelry that tells stories of history and beauty rather than pain and neglect. I have the freedom to travel, to learn, to grow, to exist without apology or minimization. Most importantly, I have myself. The real me, not the shadow I'd been trained to become. I'm generous with those who appreciate it, successful without apology, visible without shame. I've learned that choosing yourself isn't selfish when the alternative is disappearing entirely. Every Thanksgiving since that explosive dinner, I've created new traditions. Sometimes I travel to exotic locations where gratitude looks like sunrise over ancient temples or sunset on pristine beaches. There are times I host dinners for friends who've become my chosen family. People who knew me after I'd learned to value myself and loved me, not for what I could provide, but for who I am. The jewelry authentication business continues to grow, but now it grows on my terms. I've turned down opportunities that would have made me wealthier, but would have required sacrificing the life I've built. I've learned that success isn't just about numbers in a bank account, it's about building a life that feels authentic and fulfilling. I still send Grandma Rose flowers every month, beautiful arrangements that remind her someone values her wisdom and kindness. She tells me stories about my family sometimes, little updates delivered without judgment or expectation. Lily is still at her retail job, apparently becoming quite good at it despite her initial resistance. My parents have adapted to their smaller life, finding ways to be happy within their means. The family ecosystem has rebalanced without me as its financial foundation. Do I forgive them? That's a question I grapple with regularly. I think forgiveness isn't a single act, but a process, one that doesn't require reconciliation or renewed contact. I forgive the child Lily who learned too early that manipulation got results. I forgive my parents for their limitations, their inability to see beyond their fears to the daughter who needed them. I forgive myself for taking so long to realize that I deserved better. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean reopening doors that lead to rooms full of pain. It doesn't mean subsidizing dysfunction or accepting less than I deserve. I've learned that you can wish people well from a distance, hope for their growth without witnessing it, love them without liking who they choose to be. The business world has taught me many things, but perhaps the most valuable lesson came from authenticating all those pieces of jewelry. Sometimes what appears valuable on the surface is actually worthless beneath. Other times, what seems like costume jewelry turns out to be a priceless treasure. The skill lies in knowing the difference, in trusting your expertise even when others question your judgment. My family saw me as costume jewelry, pretty enough to display when convenient, but ultimately disposable. They never bothered to look closer, to see the quality beneath the surface they'd dismissed. They're lost truly because I've turned out to be quite valuable indeed. As I write this, sitting in my office overlooking Central Park, surrounded by beautiful objects that tell stories of craftsmanship and history, I feel at peace. The girl who was sent away for sneezing grew up to build something remarkable. The teenager whose achievements went unnoticed became an expert whose opinion is sought worldwide. The woman who subsidized her family's dysfunction learned to invest in her own growth instead. Would I change anything if I could go back? Perhaps I'd tell that 9-year-old girl that she wasn't dangerous or disposable, that her worth wasn't determined by her sister's health or her parents' attention. I'd tell her that someday she'd build a life so beautiful that the pain of her childhood would fade to a distant ache, like an old injury that only hurts when the weather changes. But I can't go back, and truthfully, I wouldn't want to. Every exile to Grandma's house taught me independence. Every overlooked achievement taught me to validate myself. Every moment of invisibility taught me to see myself clearly. The very neglect that could have destroyed me became the foundation of my strength. To those who might be reading this and seeing their own story reflected in mine, know this: you are not crazy for feeling hurt by favoritism. You are not selfish for building boundaries. You are not obligated to subsidize the dreams of those who couldn't be bothered to notice yours. Your success belongs to you, earned through your own effort, and no amount of shared DNA entitles anyone to the fruits of your labor. Family is a complicated word, loaded with expectations and obligations that don't always align with reality. The family we're born into shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. The family we choose, friends, mentors, partners who see our worth, can heal wounds we thought would never close. That Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago was meant to be about gratitude. And in a strange way, it was. I'm grateful it happened, grateful for the clarity it brought, grateful for the freedom that followed. I'm grateful for every moment that led me to that dining room table and gave me the strength to walk away from it. My name is Emma. I'm 42 years old, and I'm no longer invisible. I built something from nothing, succeeded despite neglect, thrived without their validation. I am not my sister's shadow or my parents' afterthought. I am a self-made woman who learned that the best revenge isn't living well. It's living authentically, fully, unapologetically. And that Thanksgiving, the one where everything fell apart, it wasn't the disaster it seemed at the time. It was the beginning of my real life. The one where I'm the main character in my own story rather than a supporting player in someone else's drama. It was the day I stopped trying to buy love that was never for sale and started investing in the love that was always available, my own. The sun is setting now over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere in Ohio, my family is living their lives, facing their choices, growing in their own ways. Here in New York, I'm preparing for a conference where I'll speak about authentication techniques to a room full of eager young professionals. Tomorrow, I'll evaluate a collection that might contain a piece worth millions. Next week, I'll fly to Paris to consult on an estate sale. This is my life now, rich in every way that matters. Abundant in opportunities I created, filled with people who value what I bring to the table. It's a life my family couldn't imagine for me because they never bothered to see who I really was. Their loss, their choice, their consequence. I am grateful, genuinely and deeply grateful for all of it. The pain that taught me resilience, the neglect that fostered independence, the invisibility that allowed me to build in peace. Most of all, I'm grateful for that moment at Thanksgiving when I finally said enough, finally chose myself, finally walked away from a table that had never truly had a place for me. My story isn't unique. There are countless invisible children out there building themselves up while being torn down, succeeding while being dismissed, thriving while being ignored. To all of you, I see you. Your achievements matter. Your worth is inherent. Your success is yours to keep. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say to family is goodbye. Looking back now, I realize there were so many moments I haven't shared yet. So many small cuts that led to the eventual severing of ties. Like the time I graduated magna cum laude from Columbia, and my parents arrived 3 hours late to the ceremony because Lily had a panic attack about them leaving her alone for the weekend. She was 22 at the time, perfectly capable of taking care of herself, but her tears were more compelling than my achievement. They missed me walking across the stage, missed my name being called with honors, missed the professor who pulled me aside afterward to tell me I'd written one of the best thesis papers he'd seen in 30 years. Or the Christmas when I was 25, working 100-hour weeks to get my business off the ground. I'd scraped together enough money to fly home and bring thoughtful gifts for everyone. A vintage brooch for my mother that I'd authenticated and knew was worth far more than she'd ever guess. A first edition book on World War II aircraft for my father, who'd always been fascinated by aviation history, and a designer scarf for Lily that had cost me 2 weeks of grocery money. I watched them open these carefully chosen presents with barely concealed disinterest. My mother actually asked if I'd kept the receipt for the brooch because she preferred gold to silver. Meanwhile, Lily received a new car, not a nice used car, but a brand new SUV that my parents had taken out a loan to afford. The contrast was so stark, it felt like performance art. There was also the weekend of my 30th birthday when I'd planned a small celebration in New York. I'd invited my family months in advance, even offered to pay for their flights and hotel. They all confirmed they'd come. I made reservations at a beautiful restaurant, arranged for a private room, even ordered a custom cake decorated with edible gold leaf as a nod to my work with precious metals. The day came and went with no family in sight. My mother called the next day to explain that Lily had decided at the last minute she wanted to go to a music festival instead, and naturally, they couldn't let her go alone. The friend who'd helped me blow out my candles that night later became my business partner, proving that chosen family often shows up in ways biological family never does. I think about the accumulation of these moments often, how they stacked up like sediment over the years. creating layers of hurt that eventually fossilized into indifference. There's a theory in geology about how mountains form tiny shifts in pressures over millions of years until suddenly you have Everest. My emotional distance from my family formed the same way, through countless small betrayals and disappointments, until one day I looked up and realized there was an insurmountable peak between us. The months following that explosive Thanksgiving taught me more about my family than the previous 40 years combined. When the direct approach failed, the angry calls, the guilt trips, the threats, they got creative. Lily started a GoFundMe claiming she needed money for medical treatments for a condition she'd never had. She used old photos of us together and wrote a sob story about how her wealthy sister had abandoned the family in their time of need. Several kind-hearted strangers donated before I could get it taken down, and I'm certain Lily kept that money despite having no medical bills to pay. My mother attempted a different strategy, reaching out to my professional network through LinkedIn with messages about how proud she was of her successful daughter and how she'd love to reconnect and celebrate your achievements properly. The same woman who couldn't be bothered to attend my college graduation was suddenly my biggest cheerleader when she thought it might give her access to my bank accounts. Several clients forwarded me her messages, confused about why my mother was contacting them. The professional embarrassment was almost worse than the personal betrayal. But perhaps the most painful manipulation came from my father, who had always been the more passive parent, content to let my mother's preferences guide family decisions. He sent me a letter, an actual handwritten letter, that for a moment made me hope. The first paragraph was everything I'd always wanted to hear. He wrote about being proud of me, about recognizing that they hadn't always been fair, about wanting to understand and make amends. For exactly one page, I felt the walls I'd built beginning to crack. Then I turned to the second page, where he laid out a fair and reasonable payment plan for what I owed them for raising me. He'd actually itemized it, estimated costs for food, clothing, shelter, and education from birth to age 18, adjusted for inflation and with interest calculated. The total came to just over $400,000, which he generously offered to round down to $350,000 as a family discount. He suggested a payment plan of $10,000 per month, noting that this was surely reasonable given my success. The letter ended with him saying he looked forward to putting this misunderstanding behind us once I'd fulfilled my obligations. I kept that letter, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of how thoroughly they viewed me as a resource rather than a person. My lawyer actually laughed when I showed it to him, saying it was the most audacious attempt at retroactive billing for parenting he'd ever seen. We filed it away in case we ever needed evidence of harassment or extortion. The legal threats came next. They found a lawyer, not a good one, but someone willing to take their money, who sent cease and desist letters claiming I was violating some imaginary contract of family support. The lawyer argued that by sending money for years, I'd established a pattern of support that they'd come to rely on, and cutting it off constituted some form of financial abuse. The claims were so ridiculous that my legal team handled them with form letters, but it showed how desperate they'd become. Through all of this, I was building something beautiful. The business expanded into museum consultations and insurance investigations. We developed proprietary technology for detecting forgeries that revolutionized the authentication industry. I started a scholarship program for young women interested in art history and gemology, remembering how isolated I'd felt as the only girl in many of my early training programs. Each success felt like a small victory, not just for me, but for every overlooked, undervalued person who'd been told they didn't matter. One evening, about a year after the Thanksgiving incident, I was at a charity gala for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was wearing a vintage Balenciaga gown and my grandmother's diamond earrings, the only family heirloom I possessed, given to me by Grandma Rose during one of my childhood exiles. I was laughing with colleagues, feeling comfortable in my skin in a way that had taken decades to achieve, when I spotted a familiar figure across the room. It was Mrs. Morrison, my high school English teacher. She'd been one of the few adults who'd noticed me during those difficult years, always making time to read my essays carefully and provide thoughtful feedback. She'd written one of my college recommendation letters, and I'd always wondered if her words about my remarkable resilience and uncommon depth of character had tipped the scales in my favor at Columbia. I made my way over to her, and her face lit up with genuine pleasure when she recognized me. We talked for nearly an hour, and she told me something that stayed with me. She said she'd always known I would do something significant, not because I was the loudest or most naturally brilliant student, but because I had the qualities she'd seen in every truly successful person she'd known. the ability to transform pain into purpose. Some people, she said, holding my hand in both of hers, are shaped by their struggles like rough stones in a tumbler. They come out polished and beautiful. Others are broken by the same process. I watched you choose to be polished, even when breaking would have been easier. That conversation illuminated something I'd been too close to see. Every slight, every disappointment, every moment of invisibility had been a grain of sand in my oyster shell. Built my pearl layer by layer, creating something beautiful from the irritation and pain. My family had given me the grit. I'd provided the nacre. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become an expert in authentication, determining what was real from what was fake, when I'd grown up in a family that couldn't recognize my authentic worth. Every day, I held precious objects up to the light, examined their qualities, verified their origins, and declared their value. I'd learned to do the same with people, relationships, and especially with myself. Around this time, I also began dating seriously for the first time. His name was David, a fellow entrepreneur who understood the demands of building something from nothing. He'd grown up with his own family challenges, a gambling-addicted father and enabling mother. So he understood why I changed the subject whenever he asked about meeting my parents. Her relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared ambitions rather than desperate need or trauma bonding. David was there the night my mother showed up at my apartment building, having somehow figured out where I lived. The doorman called up to warn me, and I watched on the security monitor as she stood in the lobby, looking older and more fragile than I remembered. For a moment, my resolve wavered. Then I saw her pull out her phone and start recording, clearly planning to document whatever interaction we might have for potential legal or emotional leverage later. I told the doorman I wasn't home and watched her wait for 2 hours before finally leaving. David held me that night as I cried, not from sadness, but from exhaustion at having to maintain boundaries that should have been natural. The holidays became exercises in creative avoidance. That second Thanksgiving after the blow-up, I took a humanitarian trip to Haiti with a group that provided medical and educational services. I spent the day helping distribute supplies and teaching English to eager children who were thrilled to have new books and pencils. Their joy at such simple gifts reminded me that gratitude isn't about having the most, but about appreciating what you have. One little girl, maybe 7 years old, gave me a drawing she'd made of the two of us holding hands. Still have it framed in my office, a reminder of what real generosity looks like. Christmas that year, I went to Switzerland, spending the holiday in a small mountain village where I'd been invited to authenticate a private collection. The family who owned it welcomed me into their celebrations, and I found myself absorbed into their warm, chaotic traditions. 3 generations gathered around the table, and while there was gentle teasing and the occasional argument, there was also genuine affection and respect for each person's individuality. It was like watching a foreign film without subtitles. I could understand the emotions even if the dynamics were completely unfamiliar. Each holiday I spent away from my family, I discovered new ways to celebrate. New Year's Eve in Tokyo, where I was consulting with a major auction house. Easter in Buenos Aires, examining a collection of colonial jewelry. 4th of July on a yacht in the Mediterranean, celebrating with clients who'd become friends. Each celebration was different, but they all had something my family holidays had never possessed. Joy unmarred by obligation, gratitude without guilt. Meanwhile, reports filtered back to me through various sources. My family's situation continued to deteriorate. Without my financial support and faced with their own poor decisions, they struggled to maintain even a modest lifestyle. Lily's attempts at entrepreneurship all failed, each one burning through whatever savings my parents had managed to accumulate. The family members who'd initially supported them grew tired of constant requests for loans that were never repaid. I heard through Grandma Rose that they'd started telling a revised version of our story. In their narrative, I'd stolen business ideas from Lily, used family money to start my company without permission, and abandoned them out of greed rather than self-preservation. The fact that Lily had never shown any interest in business and that I'd started with nothing didn't factor into their revisionist history. They needed a story that made them victims rather than architects of their own destruction. 3 years after that Thanksgiving, I received an unexpected call. It was from a hospital in Ohio. My father had suffered a mild heart attack. He was stable, expected to make a full recovery, but had listed me as his emergency contact from years ago and never updated it. The nurse on the phone was kind but confused when I explained that I would not be coming, that they should contact his wife instead. I could hear the judgment in her silence. Another person who couldn't understand how a daughter could stay away during a medical emergency. but I'd learned that emergencies were often when boundaries were most important. I knew that if I showed up at that hospital, it would be seen as forgiveness, as an opening to resume the toxic dynamics we'd played out for decades. My presence would be interpreted as permission to continue their behavior, not as a simple act of human concern. Instead, I called the hospital's billing department and quietly arranged to cover any expenses not handled by insurance, asking them to keep the source anonymous. The heart attack, I learned later, had been brought on by stress. The stress of financial pressure, of dreams deferred, of a lifestyle they could no longer maintain. Part of me felt guilty. Would this have happened if I'd continued supporting them? But my therapist reminded me that I wasn't responsible for their choices, their health, or their happiness. I'd given them years of support they'd never acknowledged. Their current situation was the natural consequence of their own decisions. 6 months later, another call. This time, it was Lily. Her voice was different, subdued, almost humble. She wanted to meet, to talk, to clear the air. She said she'd been in therapy, that she understood things now that she hadn't before. For a moment, I felt hope flutter in my chest like a trapped bird. Maybe people could change. Maybe understanding was possible. Maybe we could build something new from the ashes of our burned bridges. I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Chicago, halfway between us. I flew in with David, who waited at the hotel while I went to meet my sister for the first time in 4 years. She looked different, older, tired, wearing clothes that were clean but clearly well worn. The designer bags and expensive highlights were gone, replaced by a simplicity that might have been genuine or might have been calculated to elicit sympathy. The conversation started well. She apologized, taking what seemed like real responsibility for her role in our family's dysfunction. She talked about recognizing how she'd been enabled, how our parents' favoritism had actually harmed her by preventing her from developing real skills or independence. She even acknowledged some of the times she'd deliberately sabotaged my moments, driven by jealousy and entitlement. I found myself softening, thinking that maybe, just maybe, we could have some kind of relationship. Then she mentioned her business idea. Just casually, woven into the conversation like it was an afterthought. She'd been thinking about starting an authentication service, something small, focusing on a different market than mine. She'd been studying, learning about jewelry and antiques. Did I think it was a good idea? Could I maybe give her some advice? Perhaps look at her business plan? My heart sank as I recognized the manipulation. The therapy speak, the accountability, the humility. It had all been a performance leading to this moment. She didn't want a relationship. She wanted my expertise, my connections, probably my financial backing. The business plan she pulled out was laughably amateur, clearly put together with the help of some online template. But what hurt wasn't its quality. It was that she'd thought I was stupid enough to fall for this approach. I finished my coffee, told her I wished her luck but couldn't be involved, and left. She called after me, switching rapidly from pleading to anger to tears, cycling through manipulation tactics like a desperate gambler pulling slot machine levers. The last thing she screamed was that I'd ruined her last chance, that I was heartless and selfish, that I'd regret abandoning family when I was old and alone. David held me that night as I grieved not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd never had. The sister who could have been my best friend, my confidant, my partner in navigating our shared history. Instead, I had a stranger who saw me only as a resource to be exploited, who couldn't conceive of a relationship that wasn't transactional. That meeting clarified something crucial. I'd been holding on to hope that somewhere beneath the dysfunction, there was real love waiting to emerge. That if circumstances changed, if they got help, if they truly understood the damage they'd done, we could build something genuine. But some soil is too poisoned for anything healthy to grow. Some foundations are too cracked to support new construction. Some relationships are so fundamentally broken that the kindest thing you can do is bury them and plant something new elsewhere. The business continued to flourish in ways that amazed even me. We pioneered new authentication techniques that became industry standards. I wrote a book about detecting forgeries that became required reading in several university programs. The scholarship fund I'd established grew, supporting dozens of young women in pursuing careers in art history and gemology. Each success felt like a small rebellion against the narrative my family had written for me. I bought a house in the Hamptons, not ostentatious but beautiful, with room for the extensive library I'd always dreamed of having. Every room held carefully chosen pieces from my personal collection, not just valuable objects, but items with stories that resonated with me. Victorian mourning brooch reminded me that grief can be transformed into art. An Art Deco bracelet with a hidden compartment spoke to the secrets we all carry. A simple gold band, worn thin by decades of wear, testified to enduring love in a way my family never could. 5 years after the Thanksgiving revelation, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photo album I recognized, one my mother had kept of my childhood achievements. School photos, report cards, newspaper clippings about various accomplishments. But as I flipped through it, I noticed something disturbing. In every group photo, I'd been carefully cut out. In pictures where removal wasn't possible, my face had been scribbled over with black marker. The message was clear. I'd been erased from the family history as thoroughly as I'd erased myself from their present. Instead of pain, I felt a strange relief. They'd made visible what had always been true. I'd been a ghost in that family long before I chose to disappear. The photo album went into a box in my storage unit, along with a letter demanding payment for my upbringing and other artifacts of a relationship that had existed more in my hopes than in reality. That same year, I got married. David proposed at this museum where we'd first met, in front of a Byzantine necklace I'd authenticated that had become part of their permanent collection. The wedding was small, but perfect. Friends who'd become family, mentors who'd guided me, colleagues who'd supported my growth. Grandma Rose, now in her 80s, walked me down the aisle. She'd cut contact with my parents after learning the full truth of how they treated me, choosing justice over blood in a way that still makes me tear up with gratitude. My parents weren't invited, of course, but they found out somehow. Lily posted a long, rambling Facebook post about the cruelty of not inviting family to weddings, about how success had corrupted her sister's values, about the tragedy of choosing money over blood. Several wedding guests sent me screenshots, half amused and half appalled by her audacity. I didn't read them. I was too busy dancing with my new husband, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was rather than what I could provide. The honeymoon took us to Italy, where I'd arranged private viewings of several Renaissance jewelry collections. Standing in a Florentine palace, examining pieces worn by Medici princesses, I thought about legacy and inheritance. These jewels had passed through generations, carrying stories of love and betrayal, power and loss. Yet here they were, centuries later, valued not for the families who'd owned them, but for their inherent beauty and craftsmanship. It struck me that I was creating my own legacy, one built on expertise and integrity rather than blood and obligation. Back home, life settled into new rhythms. David and I worked on building our life together, two people who'd learned to create stability from chaos. We hosted dinner parties where conversation flowed as freely as wine, where achievements were celebrated without jealousy, where support was given without expectation of repayment. I discovered what family gatherings could be when they weren't poisoned by resentment and manipulation. The business evolved as successful businesses do. We opened an educational division, offering courses in authentication and appraisal. I love teaching, sharing knowledge with eager students who reminded me of my younger self. Many were first-generation college graduates, working multiple jobs to pay for their education, driven by the hunger that comes from having to create your own opportunities. I saw myself in their determination and made sure they knew their potential was limitless. One student in particular caught my attention. Maria had grown up in foster care, aging out of the system with nothing but determination and a sharp mind. She had a natural eye for detail and an intuitive understanding of craftsmanship that couldn't be taught. I mentored her, much as Grandma Rose had mentored me, and watched her bloom under attention and encouragement. When she graduated, I hired her immediately. She's now one of my senior authenticators, and seeing her succeed feels like a small correction to the universe's balance. 7 years after the estrangement, I received word that my mother had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. The information came through Grandma Rose, who'd heard from a mutual acquaintance. For the first time in years, I felt the pull of obligation. Should I reach out? Should I offer help? The questions tormented me for weeks, disrupting my sleep and concentration. David, wise as always, suggested I write a letter, not to send, but to clarify my own thoughts. I spent hours crafting it, pouring out everything I'd wanted to say. I wrote about the pain of being invisible, the weight of carrying family financial burdens while being treated as insignificant. Wrote about forgiveness and its limits, about love that existed despite absence, about the difference between honoring someone's role in your life and allowing them to continue damaging you. In the end, I didn't send the letter. Instead, I set up an anonymous trust to help with her care expenses. It felt like the right balance. acknowledging our shared history without reopening wounds that had finally healed. I could honor the fact that she'd given me life without giving her the power to drain life from me again. Time has a way of shifting perspectives. Now, approaching 50, I can see patterns I was too close to recognize before. My family's treatment of me wasn't personal. It was a dysfunction that would have attached itself to whoever was most vulnerable. If Lily had been the healthy child and I the sickly one, our positions might have been reversed. The favoritism was about their limitations, not my worth. This understanding doesn't excuse their behavior, but it's freed me from the weight of wondering what I could have done differently. I was a child trying to earn love from people who didn't have it to give. I was a young woman attempting to buy acceptance with success from those who could only see my achievements as threats to their narratives. I was fighting a battle that couldn't be won because the other side wasn't playing by any recognizable rules. The jewelry business has become an empire I never dreamed of building. We're international now, with offices on 4 continents. I've authenticated pieces for royalty, advised museums on acquisitions worth hundreds of millions, and testified as an expert witness in cases involving fraud and forgery. The scared little girl sent away for sneezing could never have imagined this life. But more than professional success, I've built something far more valuable, a life filled with chosen connections. My marriage is a partnership of equals, where both successes and struggles are shared. My friendships are deep and reciprocal, based on genuine affection rather than obligation. My relationship with Grandma Rose, now in her 90s but still sharp, is a treasure that reminds me that blood can sometimes transcend dysfunction. Last month, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was my maiden name, which I'd kept professionally. Inside was a message from a cousin's daughter, a young woman I'd never met. She'd found me through my company website and wanted to reach out. She was studying business and had heard family stories about my success. Reading between the lines, I could see she was experiencing her own version of family invisibility, being overlooked in favor of a more demanding sibling. I agreed to meet her for lunch. She was bright, eager, full of questions about how I'd built my business. But more than professional advice, she wanted to know how I'd survive the emotional cost. How did I deal with the guilt? How did I maintain boundaries when everything in our culture says family comes first? How did I know when enough was enough? I told her the truth, that it's the hardest thing I've ever done and the best decision I've ever made. That guilt is sometimes the price of freedom. That family coming first doesn't mean family coming only, or family at any cost. That boundaries aren't walls to keep people out, but fences to keep yourself safe. That you can honor where you came from without remaining trapped there. She cried over her salad, and I saw myself 30 years ago, desperate for someone to tell me it was okay to choose myself. I gave her my card, told her to call if she needed anything, and watched her leave with shoulders a little straighter than when she'd arrived. It felt like completing a circle, passing on the kindness that Grandma Rose and Mrs. Morrison and others had shown me when I needed it most. The business thrives, my marriage deepens, friendships evolve and strengthen. I've built a life that would have seemed impossible to the 9-year-old girl exiled for having a cold. Sometimes in quiet moments, I feel a pang for what might have been. Sunday dinners where everyone's accomplishments were celebrated equally, holidays where love wasn't rationed based on perceived need, a family where I could have been both successful and accepted. But those pangs pass quickly, replaced by gratitude for what is rather than grief for what never was. I have a husband who celebrates my victories as his own. I have friends who show up for both triumphs and troubles. I have mentees who remind me that success shared is success multiplied. I have a career that challenges and fulfills me. I have a home filled with beauty and peace. I have a life I built myself, brick by brick, authenticated by my own standards rather than anyone else's. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say to family is goodbye. Not from anger, though anger may fuel it. Not from hatred, though pain may demand it, but from love. Love for yourself, love for the life you deserve, love for the person you're becoming once you stop trying to be someone else's supporting character. My name is Emma. I'm 49 years old. I'm visible, valuable, and whole. I built an empire from exile, created family from friendship, and learned that the best revenge truly is a life well lived. Not to prove anything to anyone else, but to prove to yourself that you are always worthy of more than crumbs. That's my story, shared here in all its messy, painful, ultimately triumphant truth. To those who recognize themselves in these words, who see their own invisibility reflected in mine, know this. Your story doesn't have to end where theirs begins. You can write new chapters. You can choose yourself. You can build something beautiful from the rubble of what should have been. And sometimes that's the greatest success of all.